Hi, my name is Joe. Welcome to Da Nang, Vietnam, DANANG. I have been wanting to talk about this book for a while, Power versus Force. It was recommended by another person that I highly respect, and they are talking about psychological ideas, spiritual ideas a lot. One of the reasons why I like to read is so that I can learn to explain myself better, because sometimes I feel things, but I can't explain them very well. So I re-found out, I fell back in love with reading after many years of not reading, because I learned if you read from people that are deeply into a certain subject and you just read one of their books, it makes your vocabulary better, it makes your way of explaining yourself better because they are better. Mr. Hawkins, Hawkins, Power versus Force, because they're good at explaining it. So that's why I like this book. It also reminded me that as I've become a more mature reader, that sometimes a book will only have one piece of information that is useful to you, maybe just at that time or maybe ever. Sometimes if you go back to a book, read it later, it'll have more things that you didn't catch the first time. Sometimes you might read a whole book and there's no useful things in it. So I did find some useful things in this book for myself. And actually the funny thing about this book is the main things he was talking about I was not so interested in, but I was interested in particularly these two words, power versus force. One of the big parts of the book is where he's talking about kinesiology, like the study of the body and movement. So the point of this was he's saying that humans, we think that everything can be thought of through thinking, and if we have a problem, we're just going to use our thinking and epistemology, and I'll think and I'll analyze it and I'll figure it out, and that will give me an answer. And then he goes into one of the big parts of the book, which is talking about using the body's reaction to the environment to decide what would be a good decision or a bad decision. A big part of the book was about this. I'm not saying that I don't agree with it or disagree with it. I don't completely understand it, and I understand it a little bit, but the basic thing was that your body, in a subtle way, if you were able to measure it, its reaction to chemicals or a substance or a food or some material, it would let you know if this was a healthy thing or an unhealthy thing for your body, or if it's a good thing to do or a bad thing to do. So I'm not totally against that idea. I thought that was interesting, and I'll think about that more. Also, another interesting thing in the book was where he was actually labeling levels of human consciousness, where there's lower levels and there's higher levels. A lower level would be the kind of people that are living with shame and guilt and violence, and then a higher level is love and hope, and there's people like the Mohammeds and the Jesuses who are like enlightened type people. I thought that was pretty interesting as well. But the main thing I got from the book was power versus force. And in my own life, I felt like I had a certain power in me. Growing up, people said, you need to be like this, you need to do this. And they taught me, you need to act like this, you need to do these things. These are the physical signs of success and power in life. You get good grades, you have a good job, you accomplish things, and that's what I was taught by adults when I was a little kid. That's what power is. But in my own life, what I've experienced, now here's where the book comes in, because this is why I like this book. He explains using adjectives what power is and what force is, because power is what I've felt in my own life. It's something that's been with me my whole life, a certain kind of a power. That's exactly what it is, like a certain kind of a power. And I just, in my own life, I just always lived in such a way that, I don't know, I just want to work with other people, and I just want to be helpful. I think it would be the words unassuming. I wouldn't call myself yeah, you could say I'm a humble person. Some people will say I'm not humble because of the way I talk and the way I act and the way I say, you're making a video, that's not a humble thing to do. Well, that's not the difference between humble and not humble. You can do big things, but still do it from a very humble place. You can have a lot of things and still be a humble person. You can have a lot of power, but still be a humble person. And people can't see it around me, but this power, I could feel it in my own life. God, let's all just use the word God. God knows that I view myself as nothing, as just I'm just here. In my own mind, I never think of myself as being better, more value than the animals or the trees or even the ant. I don't even like to kill an ant, and I don't like to eat an animal. I don't like to hurt anything in my environment, and I always see people as just people to work with. But I couldn't explain this. The best way I can explain it is to use the words that he used in the book. What is power? Force cannot raise man, only the likeness. Maybe you felt this in your life when you just come from a place of being, I'm a person, there are people, we're in the earth, we're floating around the earth, we're working with each other, and the trees are there and the plants are there. Not in a hippie, get high, do drugs kind of sense, but just in a sense of understanding my place in the world. I know my place. And you know your place when a big storm comes. You realize how small you are. When you see the Grand Canyon, you realize how small you are. And I realize I'm only so capable in my own gifts that God has given me with my body. So there's a certain kind of humbleness there. Force cannot raise men, only the likeness of power. Let me go through the description of what power is. Power effortlessly supports significance of life. It's noble. Power appeals to what uplifts, dignifies. It gives life energy. It brings joy. Let's talk about people's actions. Power does not require justification. You don't have to explain it to anyone, because if it's coming from power, people will accept it. It requires nothing from the outside. It's self-evident. Those who love from power need say very little. Best way I can explain this, requiring no justification. It's self-evident, and people who love from power need say very little. I've found that while I've been traveling, because I meet people from other cultures, and sometimes we can't always communicate using words, but we can communicate using our facial expressions. And when I meet people who can't speak my language, there's a communication there, there's an energy there, and that's what you're feeling power. When I can see your face and you can see my face and I show a gesture or carrying acts, that's power. I don't need to explain anything. You know what the right thing to do is. That's power. Now force is going to be, what are some words to explain what force is? You have to justify force. It can be arguable, it's literal, it's concrete. It must be justified. It must be fed energy. It always creates a counter force. It's polarizing, us versus them, me versus you. I'm better, you're better, I'm above you, you're below me. Somebody always loses with force. And force requires constant defense. And you can feel that when you're, now take the two words power and force and apply them to people, apply them to organizations, and apply them to, that's more fun, and apply them to governments. And you can feel the difference between power and force. You've met people that operate using power, and you can just look at them and you know that there's a life-giving force coming from them. And then you've met people that operate from force, and something doesn't feel right about them. They're trying to force something to go into a spot, and they're trying to use rules and justification and make excuses and reasons to force something to happen. And that happens with people, it can happen with organizations, and it can happen with governments as well. I also like in the book where he explains, go easy a little bit on organizations and governments, because organizations and governments, they're imperfect. They try to do the best they can with the resources they have. So, of course, organizations and governments are always going to be an imperfect way of working with society's problems. And I can understand that. It's imperfect, it's got too many moving parts, so it's never going to be a perfectly working system, either an organization or a government. Societies fall back to force because they lack the reality base for effective problem resolution. So there's wars, taxations, rules, and regulations. I think what he means by this is that the reason why we have this war and why we have to force people to do things is because they're living their lives in a way that is not coming from power. If life was coming from power, we could just communicate with each other and we can come up with solutions that would be beneficial to other people. And this is what I've kind of felt in my own life. Sorry to be talking about myself in this, but this is why I needed to read this book, was to explain the feeling that I have. Like, I don't care about those people over there, those people over there. I just, what can we do to be living? I never thought about who's in control, who has more power, who's got more force than the other people. I just thought people are people, and let's just have a good time here. Let's just work together. And so when you have things like wars and you have to force things to happen, that's when you're having to go more towards force and you're getting away from power. If we can live from a sense of power, then we can cooperate more easily. And then I'll finish with one really cool thing that he called the fatal faults of thought. I have to read this one because it's very detailed and I have to read it exactly. Number one was, so they're called the fatal faults of thought. Think about any time you've communicated with someone else. I'm talking with you, I'm thinking about what you're saying, and you're thinking about what I'm saying. What are the 4 faults of thought? The first one is failure to differentiate between subjective and objective. So if I'm talking to you, sometimes the things you say or the same things I say are from my subjective experience. So for me to completely understand what you're saying and to think about it, I need to understand that you have your own subjective experience. Not everything is objective. So I need to take that into consideration when I talk to you. That you've had your own experience in life, and there's forces that are acting on you in your life. And it would be a fault of mine to think so objectively of what you say. The second one is the disregard of the limitation of context inherent in basic design and terminology. I think what that means is it's just talking about the effectiveness of language and the inability for me to understand what you're talking about and think about what you're talking about just using language, and also the situations that we're in. It's completely impossible for me to completely think about you and your situation if I'm not there and I'm not you. I'm not experiencing it in a subjective way. And if you tell me about it, I'll never be able to completely accurately understand what you're telling me. The third one is ignorance of the nature of causality. I think what this means is that things are caused by other things. Results are caused by actions. Reactions are caused by certain actions, and we tend to forget about this when we think about life, when we observe life. We forget that things are causing other things. Actions are causing reactions. And number 4, I'm having a hard time differentiating that from number 3, misunderstanding. Okay, number 3 is ignorance of the nature of causality. Number 4 is misunderstanding the nature of causality. So ignorance, number 3, being that you just not paying attention to that things cause other things. I think that's when you see people and they're just like, what? How did they just focus on right now? They're forgetting that things happen in steps, in a process over time. And then the 4th one, misunderstanding the nature of causality. I think that's failing to understand what things and how things led to other things to happen. What actions and how these actions led to other reactions. That was another thing that was kind of off of the main point of the book, which was the whole kinesiology thing of your body telling you what's right and wrong. You eat something, your body immediately will tell you if it's right or wrong, healthy or unhealthy. You touch a substance, a metal, immediately your body will have a reaction because it knows if it's right or wrong. A couple offshoots in the book were things like the fatal faults of thought, which, you know, the whole body reaction thing I might not completely agree with, but things like the fatal faults of thought, the difference between power and force, I thought were really useful. So I was just picking those out from my own life. I want to be able to describe thinking better, what is effective and ineffective thinking, and then I also wanted to explain the differences between power, which I felt my life has had some power in it, and I want to live my life in a sense of power. I don't want to live my life from a sense of force, trying to force things to happen, forcing people to do certain things around me, forcing the world to live from power. So I do recommend that you at least look through this book. Maybe you don't accept all of it. That's probably like all books, right? You don't accept the whole book and everything in it. Maybe even books sometimes don't even have anything useful in them. But I definitely recommend you look through Power versus Force and at least take some of the ideas out of the book. And thank you, Mr. Hawkins, for writing this book from Da Nang, Vietnam. Good night.